Hey guys, in this video we're going to be taking a look at chapter 24 of the Ecce textbook called Always Tomorrow. Now in this chapter we're going to return to the dative case and see how it can be used with a couple more special verbs, and we're also going to come back to the ablative case to finish off a few more uses of that. The main part of this grammar though is going to be finishing off the tenses. So by the end of this video you'll see the last two tenses, which are called the pluperfect and the future perfect, and we'll see how they relate to the four that we've already learned throughout the book. To start, let's take a look at the derivatives for chapter 24. So the first word we want to look at is advēnerant. Now, this verb means they had arrived, and I want you to really pay attention to how I said that in English. I didn't say they arrive or they arrived, I said they had arrived. There's something slightly different about the way that I translated that. That has to do with one of the tenses we're going to see as we go through this chapter. In terms of derivatives though, you can see this word leads us to derivatives such as adventure, advent, and avenue, and they all have to do with arriving somewhere. The next noun we have is moles. Now, this noun literally means a mass in Latin, but it has some interesting derivatives that you might not have thought of. So the first one is molecule, which you've probably seen in chemistry class. Molecule literally has the Latin word for mass in it. The cul at the end is a diminutive. It's making it the small version, basically. So a molecule is just a small mass. The same goes for mole, mole. Now we're not talking about the animal here, we're talking about chemistry class again. A mole is a unit of measurement. So again, it comes from that Latin stem of mass. The next word is vīderat, and again, this has a special ending to it and a special English translation. It means he had seen. The derivatives we get from this are evident, evidence, view, television, revise, vision. They all have to do with seeing something. But the real point of it being in this chapter is how we translated it. It's not he saw, it's he had seen. Again, it's a different tense. The next word we have is ludi, which we've seen before. It means games. And in English, we get the derivatives interlude and prelude, and they have to do with a game or a show. So the prelude is what becomes before the show or the game. The interlude is what happens during or in the middle of a game. The next verb we have is lego legere, which means to read, and we've seen it before. Now you can see all four of the principal parts. Just a refresher on the derivatives, we get words like legible, lecture, eligible, elect. They have to do with reading something. The next word we have is licet, or licere in the infinitive. And I want you to pay attention. In the vocab list, you'll see it has plus dat dot. That means it goes with the dative case. And we're going to explore that a little more in this chapter. But this verb always goes with the dative. And it means to be allowed or to be permitted to do something. And in English, you get words such as license, licentious, illicit. And if you think of the word illicit, the IL in Latin is related to IN and eventually UN in English words, which is a negation. So illicit means something that's not permitted. That's where we get that word from. Next we have liber libri. This word means book, and it leads to derivatives such as library, librarian. You know, a library is pretty simple. It's the place where the books are. The librarian is the person who watches after the books. What I want you to pay attention to, though, is the way it's spelled. And you'll notice that liber, book, has a short I. Liber, with a long mark over the I, means something different. It means free. This is where you get the word for liberty in English. But you want to pay attention. There is a difference between these two words. Next, we have arcus, which means an arch. And in English, one of the derivatives is either arc or arch, which makes sense. What this really means in Latin is it's a word for bow, and if you think about it, an archer pulling on the bow makes that arc shape. The two words are very much related to each other, so this is actually where you get the word archer from too in English. The next verb we have is edificare. Now this verb means to build. And we've seen it before in previous chapters. The derivatives are words such as edifice, edify, edification. But again, in this chapter, you really want to pay attention to the four principal parts. And what we saw in previous chapters was the noun form of this word, edificium, which means a building. So edificium, building, edificare, to build. They're related to each other. The next word we have is aistu. Now, this word is related to one that we've seen before, aistate, which means in the summer. Aistu is a word that means heat, or in the heat. And it's related to the word for summer because summer is the month with the most heat. So those two words go together. Next, we have circumire, which means to go around. And in Latin, the word this is related to is circum, which literally means around. Think of the word circus, for instance. It's a round shape or a round racetrack, the Circus Maximus. So if you take circum, which means around, and put ire on the end of it, you're going to get the infinitive of circumire, which means literally to go around. So if you break this word apart, it's really not that bad to remember the four principal parts and the definition. So the first part of the grammar we're going to look at, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, is the dative case. So we're going to come back and look at how the dative gets used with intransitive compound verbs. If we just recap the dative case quickly, you'll probably remember that the dative case is often used as the indirect object of a sentence. And the indirect object is the person or thing that explains to whom or for whom an action is being done. So for instance, if I said, I throw the ball to the boy, if I ask the question, to whom? To whom do I throw the ball? The answer is going to be the boy, or to the boy. That's the dative case and the indirect object, which is how we've seen it used for most of the previous chapters. A compound verb is something that happens when you take a verb and add a prefix to it to expand the meaning. So an example from our book is occurrere. If we were to break this verb down, you have currere, which means to run, and ob, which means against. The translation we get is to run against, literally, or to encounter is how we translate it, in a better way in English. But if you break this word apart, you have a compound verb here. You've taken the prefix ob and stuck it in the front of currere. Now, if you're looking at it and wondering why the OB turns to an OC, there is a grammatic reason for this. Don't worry too much about it, but usually when you have a B coming up against a C like that, instead of saying ob currere, the B will morph into a C. It just sounds better in Latin. And again, if you break it apart, you get the meaning, to run against or to encounter. These compound verbs are intransitive, meaning they're not going to take a direct object, which would be in the accusative case. Instead, they take the dative. So again, you want to think when you see these special compound verbs, they're intransitive and they're going to be going with the dative. So let's take a look at an example of this. If you had ibi fortasse patri tuo occurremus, it means perhaps we will meet your father there. If we break this down, you're probably going to start by asking the question, who will we meet? The answer is patri tuo, which means your father. Now, normally when we answer the question who, we're using a direct object, but I just told you that these type of verbs are using the dative case, not the accusative, so there is no direct object here. Instead, you have to remember that compound verbs such as occurrere take the dative. The dative in this example is patri tuo, your father. Now we know that the dative is usually translated to or for, but you don't want to do that with these special compound verbs. Instead, just translate it as your father. It might sound a little weird because you're thinking of a direct object in your head, but what you're actually going to see in Latin is the dative. Once you get used to it, it's really not that bad. Here's another example. Jam urbi apropinquabant. It means they were already approaching the city. Again, if you ask the question what are they approaching or what were they approaching? The answer is going to be urbi, the city. But again, if we pay attention to how urbi is spelled, you can see it's not in the accusative case. Instead, what you have happening here is apropinquare, which is one of these compound verbs, which is always intransitive that we're looking at. It's going to be taking the dative. So instead of seeing urbem, which would be the accusative, we end up with urbi, which is the dative. So you're more literally saying they were approaching to the city. That's kind of how we would translate dative. But when they go with these compound verbs, don't use to or for. Just translate the city, and you'll come up with the right answer. The second part of the grammar is going back to the ablative case. And we're going to look at another use of the ablative. It's called the ablative of cause. So the ablative case is one of the most complex in Latin, and you've probably noticed that since early on in the book when we first started learning about it. It has many different uses. So at its core, it usually describes how something happened. This new use of the ablative of cause, is just another variant on how something occurs. and it's used to explain the cause or reason that something happened. So for instance, if we had this sentence, tua culpa raida in fossa est, we would translate it, it's by your fault that the carriage is in the ditch. The ablative of cause here is tua culpa. You can see the long A ending makes it ablative. You're explaining the reason why the carriage is in the ditch. So in other words, you're saying, how did the carriage end up in the ditch? Or why is it in the ditch? The answer is, it's by your fault, or it's your fault that. That's what we call the ablative of cause, because tua culpa is the cause for the carriage being in the ditch, if that makes sense. Here's another example. You have magna ira commotus. It means moved by great anger. The ablative is magna ira. You can see that with the two long A's as the ending. It's first declension. This is another ablative of cause. You're explaining how someone was moved. The answer is by great anger. That's what moved this person. It's the cause of this person's being moved. And again, here, commotus doesn't mean move like physically moving something. It means emotionally moved. And again, you're explaining the cause or the reason why. That's what the ablative of cause does. So just a quick note and something you really want to pay attention to, the ablative of cause does not use a preposition. That's a little different from what we've seen before. A lot of times you'll see the ablative going with a preposition. If you look back at the two examples we just did, neither one of them has a preposition with them. It's just the ablative on its own. So when you see the ablative without a preposition in front of it, take a minute and think, could this be an ablative of cause? Sometimes it will be, so it's worth thinking about. So this brings us to the main grammar for this chapter, and it's the last two tenses that we're going to be looking at. The first one is the pluperfect tense. Now you can tell just off the bat, looking at what it's called, it's going to be related to the perfect, which means it's probably got something to do with the past. This is just another way of explaining an action that happens in the past, and you'll see how we do that in Latin and in English. So to start, we just want to recap the tenses. And remember, we've already established that tenses are just ways of describing the time when an action occurred. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, you've seen 4 of them so far: the present, the imperfect, the perfect, and the future. Now you're going to learn a 5th way to describe actions. And in this case, it's going to be a new way of describing an action in the past. So here's a quick recap of what we've seen so far. We've seen the present, the imperfect, the perfect, and the future. And again, pay attention to how all these verbs are spelled. For the present tense, we have the T ending, Marcus mutters. For the imperfect, we have the BA infix. It changes it to Marcus was muttering. You've put it into the past tense and you're describing an action over a period of time. The V in musawit is the indicator of perfect tense. The IT ending also gives it away. Now you've made it Marcus muttered, which is something we learned in previous chapters. And finally, you have the BIT ending, which we learned last chapter is the indicator of future tense when you have a first or second conjugation verb. It changes the meaning to Marcus will mutter. Now we have the pluperfect tense. So take a look at this sentence. You have Marcus quoque stupuit, quamquam circum antea vīderat. If we translate this, you'll get Marcus was also amazed, although he had seen the circus before. If you break this apart, one of the main verbs is stupuit, which means Marcus was amazed. This we know is perfect tense. It has the U, which is an infix that indicates perfect tense, and the IT ending gives it away. We translate it as an action that happened in the past. But we also have this verb vīderat, which is one of our vocab words. And look how we translated it. It's not he saw, it's he had seen. That difference in English is telling you something different about the timing of when this happened in the past. So if you hear this in English, he had seen, you know we're talking about the past and not the future, but we have to break apart where in the past are we talking about. So the pluperfect tense is what we use to describe actions that happen in the past, but they happen before another action in the past. That's the key phrase here. Even the name gives this away. The term pluperfect comes from the Latin phrase plusquam perfectum, which literally means more than complete or more than finished. So if we think about it, We're trying to talk about two actions in the past. What happens if one happens before the other? That's what we need to break down here. So if we think of our timeline of where the tenses fall, these are the four we've seen so far. We have the present, the future, the perfect, and the imperfect. We're going to add to that a fifth tense, the pluperfect, and this is where it would actually fall on our timeline. It's in the past, but it's happening before another action. Now that other action we're talking about is going to be either perfect or imperfect. The pluperfect happens before that. That's the main difference here. So if we go back to our sentence of Marcus was also amazed, although he had seen the circus before, let's take a look at where these verbs fall on our timeline. The first verb, stupuit, is perfect tense, and you can see I've highlighted in red where it would fall on our timeline. Vīderat is pluperfect, and you can see here it's coming before the perfect tense verb. So in other words, if you have two actions, Marcus was amazed, he had seen the circus. Which one comes first? Vīderat, he had seen the circus. That's an action that happened before this other action in the past. So how do we form the pluperfect tense? The first thing you want to do is to go to the third principal part of the verb. And remember, that's the first person singular in the perfect tense. And if you think back, I mentioned at the beginning of the video, pluperfect is related to the perfect tense. This is one of the ways that happens. It's using the same principal part to start its spelling. What you have to do is drop that long I ending, which would be a perfect tense ending. We don't use perfect tense endings because we're in the pluperfect. The endings we are going to use are something you've seen before. You add on the imperfect forms of the verb esse, the verb to be. That's what forms the ending to the verb. So in other words, the pluperfect is just the perfect stem plus the imperfect of the verb to be. Now I know that sounds a little confusing, but let's take a look at some examples and you'll get the hang of this quickly. So let's take a look at the verb parare, to prepare. The first thing we do is go to the third principal part, parawi. We want to drop the long I ending. When you do that, you have our stem for the pluperfect, parav. Now we add on the imperfect forms of the verb to be. They go eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratus, erant. If you put them all together, now you can spell the pluperfect. You have paraweram, paraweras, and down the line. And look at how we translate them. You're saying, I had prepared, you had prepared, he or she had prepared, we had, you all had, they had. The word had is what tells you in English you're talking about the pluperfect tense. This brings us to the last part of the grammar, the future perfect tense. Now, this is the sixth and final tense that we're going to be learning, and you can tell by the name, future perfect, that it's going to be incorporating aspects of the future and the perfect tenses. So to start, we want to just take a look at an example sentence. So if you were to see this, and it comes out of our book, cum ad forum cras redieritus, Euclides omnia vobis explicabit. You would translate it, when you will have returned to the forum tomorrow, Euclides will explain everything to you. Now if we take a look at the different verbs in the sentence, the first one you're probably going to identify right away is explicabit. And you notice that it's a first conjugation verb, explicare, and it has the bit ending. This is what we know is the future tense, and that's why we translate it, Euclides will explain everything. The second verb in the sentence is redieritus. Now, it might look like pluperfect, but you'll notice that instead of an eratis, we have eritis. There's something different going on in the ending. And if you look at how we translate it into English, you'll see that the translation is totally different. It's you will have returned. This is what we're going to be looking at in this last part of the video. It's called the future perfect tense. So the future perfect tense is what we use to describe actions that happen in the future before another action in the future. Now if you think about it, this is basically the opposite side of the spectrum from pluperfect. So with pluperfect, we said it describes actions that happen in the past before another action in the past. This is the same idea, but we're talking about future tense now. And if you want to think of an example in English, it would sort of be like if you were talking about your graduation from high school. You might say, by the time I will graduate high school, I will have passed Latin class. You're saying that the thing farthest in the future is graduating high school, but before that, but also in the future, you need to pass Latin class. That's what the future perfect tense describes. So if we think about the timeline we've been using, it would look something like this. And you notice we filled in on the far left the pluperfect tense that we learned earlier in this video. Now you have the future tense and a gap between present and future. This is where the future perfect lies. So if we think back to that sentence we were looking at, we'll put the different verbs and I'll show you where they fall on this timeline. The first one is explicabit, which we said is just normal future tense. So this would be the farthest thing out in the future. Euclides will explain everything to you. The second verb, redieritis, is future perfect. It means you will have returned. And if you look at the timeline, you'll notice there's a second action that happens farther in the future than this one. So in other words, the first thing to happen will be you will have returned to the forum. The second thing that happens is Euclides will explain everything to you. So again, the future perfect here is describing an action in the future that happened before another action in the future. Sometimes we call this tense the past of the future, if that makes sense. And if you think about this timeline, you can kind of see how it fits. So how do we form the future perfect tense? The rules are going to seem very familiar because they're almost the exact same idea as pluperfect. To start, you go to the third principal part, which is the first person singular perfect tense. And you're going to drop the long I ending. This will give you the stem, the perfect stem. On this, we're going to add the future tense form of the verb esse. Now again, this is where pluperfect and future perfect distinguish from each other. So in pluperfect, we would have added the imperfect of the verb to be. In future perfect, we're adding the future tense form of the verb to be. That's the main difference. So if we take our example verb, parare, and you go to the third principal part, drop that long I, you're going to have your stem of P-A-R-A-V. To this, we're going to add on the future tense of the verb esse, ero, eris, erit, eramus, eritus, erant. When you add these two together, you have the future perfect tense. And what you're saying with verbs such as parawero are I will have prepared, or you will have prepared, he, she will have prepared, and down the line. This is the future perfect tense. So if we pay attention to the endings here, there's one that will probably stick out to you as being not quite what you expected. And that's the third person plural, which I've highlighted here in red. Now, think to how we conjugate esse in the future tense. You probably remember it goes ero, eris, erit, eramus, eritus, erant. That third person plural, erant, is the problem, and it has to do with the perfect tense. So if we think back to our perfect tense endings, you'll see that the third person plural is also erant. This is a problem because the future perfect is using the third principal part of the verb for its stem. So in other words, if we took the third principal part of parawi, dropped the long I, and added an erunt, you'd be creating the perfect tense, not the future perfect. They would overlap. So this is why in future perfect, to avoid the confusion, we use an erint instead of an erunt. It's a subtle difference, but it's an important one because if you miss that vowel, you've completely changed the tense of the verb and you've changed the meaning dramatically. As you go through the book though and practice some sentences, it'll get much easier for you to spot the erint ending as being future perfect tense.